very important. But frankly, this is larger. This is more important. Because with all due respect to the fascia field, which is actually the tools of the transformation, and without the fascia understanding, we're really not going anywhere in terms of the big breakthroughs when it comes to cerebral palsy, and actually all around in the health advancement matters. But nonetheless, this is the tool set. And this tool set belongs to the larger thing. And this is really important because, I've been so much focused on this. It's amazing data. The whole fascia thing is absolutely amazing data. But this is really important to understand, that if the new and exciting data is put into the old and deficient concept, what happens? Nothing. You just waste all your beautiful, elegant, and potentially groundbreaking discoveries. So that's where the salutogenic thing comes in. And it's been discovery after discovery after discovery. What I want to share today, I've labeled them as the salutogenic discoveries. They're going to be 10 that I'm going to cover today. The biomedical side, and the 3 on the other page, that's going to be more on the social side, right? And this is really another incredibly important point, that we're covering the biosocial entirety here. And I'm going to assist myself a little bit with this board. I can talk for hours, so I'm going to try to keep it compact, just in order to make sure that I'm not really getting too far away and this is not turning into the 2 hours video. Well, testing your ability to watch me talking. So, with this introduction, let's dive in and let's get to the point. Salutogenesis and the salutogenic discoveries. I've kind of laid it out in this format, so mostly to keep myself on track, but I hope that's going to give you some narrative of the transitions as well. So, first of all, the first point, I'm lifting up the number 1 here. Well, of course, it's very small, so you wouldn't be able to read it, but anyway, I'm going to read it. Now, the first salutogenic discovery, positive health definition. And actually, not only positive, it's operational, right? It's really workable, operational health definition. And I must say that it's underappreciated by most in the medical community, simply by the fact that people just, perform and don't bother about it. But I must say that I realized that fact, that there is no such thing as the positively defined, actively defined what is health, not as what is the absence of the disease, right? But there is no active definition of what is health in medicine. I've discovered, found out semi-accidentally this around 94. And it was really mind-blowing. How could a field, a domain exist and actually put certain goals forth if they don't have the definition of where they're going to? I mean, it's wonderful to have the definition of what you want to run away from, but running away from is a very limited perspective if you don't know where you're actually going to. And that's unfortunately the situation in medicine. That's the fundamental pathogenic or the anti-pathogenic paradigm that medicine is based on. And those of you who spoke to me not once and not twice know that I always keep telling you this basic thing. When you get something from the doctor which says, well, your child's EEG or X-ray or whatever was normal, don't get it wrong. Normal in that sense is the not pathological according to the current criteria. It doesn't mean that it's right? It's like the classic example, subluxation. It has to be, the hip misplacement has to be 1/3 and more off to warrant to be labeled as the subluxation. So that would be subluxation. If it's 25% off, it's not a subluxation. So therefore, technically speaking, it's not a pathology yet. But obviously, there is a big difference between 0 and 25% shift, right? Versus like a larger difference between 0 and 25 than 25 and 33. But somehow, all these things get blurred. Or for instance, when you talk to a practitioner and you get this whole idea of let's observe. Observation of hip subluxation or observation of the scoliosis and so on. If you think from this setup like normal reasoning, right? Because normally in life you tend to set some goals in a positive way. So something that you want to move towards to, right? Not away from simply. So that's not what's happening here, and that's why the observation is basically the idea of, well, only if our losses or if the deviation takes some critical level, then we're going to get some action. So that's the anti-pathogenic, that's the fundamental background of the entire medical reasoning. So the big transformation of the salutogenesis is actually officially kind of bringing the attention to this and making it operational. So really bringing in the whole point that we need the positive definition of health, and positive definition of health is really instrumental if we are to move anywhere forwards. So that's the first big thing, right? And therefore, if we look at it closer, what we're going to see, I'm just going to use this framework, right? So if we think about it this way, if we draw the line, right? If we draw the line and say somewhere here is the diagnosis. So basically, what does the medical thing imply is that between the diagnosis and termination, there is the territory where medicine works. So basically, this is it. And that's where the whole battle takes place. And that's why you have so much of this fight against, the battle with cancer, the war against cancer, or fight against the spasticity, battle against the hip subluxation. So this kind of military language comes from this anti-pathogenic, right? The pathogens attack and we fight against them. So that's the fundamental part. Now, what is happening? There is no positive definition of health. While once you don't have the diagnosis, well, there is nothing specific to say. Of course, as the years go by and instrumental methods improve, what happens is the position of the diagnosis moves further away, right? If before, really, like with cancer, right, they were only able to catch it when it was, second stage, which wasn't good, right? So because it was already very much on the way here. So now, for many cancers, they're able to catch it, let's say, at the first stage. So which is great in terms of the prevention of further deterioration, so therefore it's easier to keep it at bay. So this is great, and this is not to argue against it, but my point here is different. This is the shift, this is the move of the zero. So the zero moves further away, so the ability to establish the diagnosis and build the prognosis has improved. But that is a completely different story from being able to define health positively. So this has been the first really large breakthrough that came from Dr. Antonovsky, who actually established the idea of the salutogenesis. So his point was that if we talk about the dis-ease, which goes here, and the ease, which goes there. So anything that moves, the movement towards the ease would be the positive health definition, and disease would be the, anti-disease would be the other thing. Now, the typical framework that is being used to explain this better, right, is what they use is the river, so-called river analogy. Like if you think of the river, right, and basically some people being in that river, and the river ending up with the cliff where the people drop off and drown, right? So this is it. So in this river of life, the medical position is about saving the ones who are drowning, or about the ones who are actually about to get off the cliff or off this like terrible waterfall, or whatever way you'll put it. So that's what the medical predicament is about, saving those ones and bringing them on shore. Now, his claim and his basic statement was that there is no such thing as being safely on shore. All of us are in this river of life from the very beginning to the end. And the thing is that what we need is not to be saved and put on shore because the shore doesn't exist. It's the ability to swim the other way. That's what is important. So that would be the positive definition of health, meaning that it's the central focus there, right, is to recognize that stresses and challenges are all around us, right? But what happens, what makes a difference, is how we transform them. This is absolutely critical. This is a very fine moment, but this is absolutely critical, because that gives you this understanding. Like, what works? It's not a subsidy. It's not like provision of some good and beneficial things. It's the ability to transform the stresses that come into you. But I'm going to get back to this a little bit later. So that's a big transition. Establishment of the positive definition. Now, obviously with this, straight away, upon further analysis, what we're going to get, there is more. If you take this principle and go further, you're going to find out that there is a full 2x2 matrix here, which is really going to be a big transformation. Because with this big transformation, what is happening? You see, if that was just one quadrant, one position, one place, then this was the 0 and then plus and minus. Now, what we're having the full scale. If we start looking further and say, okay, this is the total position, so this is where we've got the diagnosis, right? Well, probably it makes sense for me to redraw it in a slightly larger way, right? So this is where we are. So this is the diagnosis. Now, what we have actually these 4 quadrants. Everything here behind the diagnosis, so that would be the anti-pathogenic effort. But at the same time, so which would be kind of the presence of the excessive presence of the elements of the disease. Now, what is this? The positive side? Well, this is the absence, right? So this is the non-pathological state. You don't have those detectable diagnostic things. Now, what happens? Here, the positive side moves up. So this is the health advancement here. So basically, you look here for the abundance of what he called the specific salutary factors. And what does it mean? That gives us a new interpretation of what's happening here in the department of the diagnosable troubles, right? So now we can look at this as the salutary deficit. And this is really very important aspect, because salutary deficit and antipathogenic, even though they are both recognized as the negatives, they would be differently defined. So you will be doing completely different things if you want to build extra salutary resources as opposed to the fight against the pathogenic phenomenon. Well, why this distinction is so critically important? Let me try to get this a bit clear. You see what we can do here? We can get the division, and let's kind of call them hemispheres, right? So you see that would be the diagnostic hemisphere, diagnosable, right? And that will be the non-diagnosable hemisphere. Now, what's happening here? As we see this, what does it mean? That means that any diagnosable condition has not one, but two components into it. A component of the pathogenic kind of negatives and the component of lacking of the salutary positives. What's the most important about this is to understand that what I call those two, they're transcategorical, meaning that the diagnosis that you get here and the distinctions and all the categories that you get here in this part are completely inapplicable there. So, to be more specific, let's put it this way. Now, for instance, what we have two clearly distinct things. For instance, I don't know, like any infectious disease, I don't know, malaria, right? So something very bad and negative. What do we have there? Because this is a clearly identifiable external factor and so on, what do we have? We have, say, 99% of the, or maybe 95% of the distinguishable disease factor, right? So this is disease factor. And maybe 1% of the salutary deficit. Now, if we talk about an injury, a trauma, right? A person breaking the leg, right? So what is this? The same story, 99% and 1%. And this is the field where medicine, the anti-pathogenic medicine, is doing extremely well. Especially if we take aside all the economics and so on, but fundamentally it has the expertise of dealing extremely well with this. Now, this is the part of the impairments, right? Cerebral palsy is the impairment. Stroke is the impairment. Autism is an impairment. It's not a disease, so basically it's a reverse. Maybe it has 5% of the disease, like identifiable external narrow specific factor, and it has 95% of the salutary deficit. So that's why, once you understand this, that clearly explains why medicine, current existing healthcare framework, is not doing well at all over here. And when you will get to understand this, I hope that you will understand better all of those GMFCS curves, right? So which are going this way. Because that shows you that the salutary factors being so weak and nobody addressing the salutary, the absence of the salutary factors, this is where you get the trouble. And that's the reason why I so much opposed the entire word therapy. Because again, therapy is defined in these categories, right? Good therapy is a therapy which works specifically, which works fast, and which actually works being delivered by external specialists. And ABR is none of that. So I actually, at some point in time, I was even trying to figure out the word which I call the continuous incremental developmental advancement, right? CIDA. But I didn't even release it because, even our own team, they were saying, well, Mr. Bloom, you are bringing up these extra complicated notions. People they're looking for something familiar, right? They're already having lots of new things to learn, so let's stick to the therapy. But, this is really important that indeed it's not a therapy, it's transcategorical. So when we talk about for instance, chest strengthening, your child, a quadriplegic child, doesn't have any specific pathology, right? If one measures their, oxygenation of the blood and it's kind of okay, that means that things are doing all right in terms of the metabolism. But there is a profound salutary deficit, so it's a different set of categories, different set of, signs that you have to look at, and of course, from that all the way you go further and further and further. And technically speaking, if we get back to the medical terminology, right? So what happens here? You have symptoms, you have symptoms as the elementary signs, and you try to deal with them, and you have syndromes. So basically, if we use the medical terminology, the salutary deficit syndromes and the antipathogenic, the disease syndromes, they are not matching each other. They're completely different. And that's why, for instance, when we talk about the spasticity, right? What happens? Spasticity currently is being defined this way, being defined in the medical framework. And that's where they bring all these explanations and so on, linking it to the brain. But from a salutary perspective, what is spasticity? Spasticity is the absence of the controlled deceleration. That's it. And it doesn't have to be in the extremities, it can be anywhere, right? So once you see the elements of the poorly controlled deceleration, that's it. That's spasticity. Once you see the presence of uncontrolled acceleration elements, that's spasticity. And before, without this, when everything was kind of confined into this single square, we all were fighting for this space. Them and us. So basically, if you try to give two definitions to spasticity, one is this, deficit of inhibition and all these other things which come from whatever receptors and so on, would be a classic neurological thing. And then you try to come up with the deceleration deficit explanation. Basically, you're competing at the same territory. And who wins? The one who has the legal and the authority power. So it was squashed competitive space. So therefore, this transition that now, with this new definition, we have the separate spaces. It's absolutely huge transition, because now we can legitimately use two completely different sets of terminologies without kind of getting into a clash, without being in opposition. And again, it would be stupid to deny the benefits of medical profession and the medical help here in this department. When it comes to everything infectious, acute, and so on. So this is exactly where the antipathogenic framework is needed. And even when we talk about the entire situation of dealing with the cerebral palsy, when I talk to the professionals, what would be the popular example that I get? Like, for instance, a pretty good friend of mine from the biointegrity group. When we started talking about Botox with him, what's his first argument? Says, well, last week I've got this family, and this is a drug addict mother who has 4 kids from 4 different partners, and this last kid has quadriplegia, and basically the kid is screaming out of pain because she can't even change the diaper. So I do the Botox injection, and she's, the screams are gone. Well, what is this? This is from here. And of course, that's a completely different scenario, right? This is a scenario of medical profession defending the child against neglect. But even though it has been a Botox injection which reduced this negative factor, but of course this type of mother is never going to work on the salutary deficit, so the troubles are going to return and return and return. But we talk about a different level of person. So when we talk about the families who self-elected to be the ABR families, this is a completely different quality of the person. And for this different quality of the person, not the F students of life, but more the A students, you need completely different approach. And again, before that wasn't possible. Everyone was competing and was stuck in this antipathogenic framework, to the point that actually, of course, the medical community was also very defensive about it when somebody else comes in and says, well, guys, you're doing this wrong and so on. So what do? They bring these examples and say, hey, what we do is actually valuable and it's working. So don't try to deny this. And again, when we were in the same space, in the same quadrant, that was extremely difficult. Like we were talking about different things, but being in the same space. So now this is over. Now we can all be in our separate spaces and we can have the total freedom there. So we can define the salutary progress. We actually, if we are working with the cerebral palsy, we're working at the, North America here. So this is going to be the northwest. They work at the southwest. So basically, this is the whole story. Like, this is a huge transformation, right? Now, obviously, my plan of being short is not really working very well, but I hope that I'm not doing too badly, right? So I probably am going to have to stretch this video over, several parts, because I'm pretty sure I'm already at the half-an-hour mark, and I'm just at point number 2. So, the number 3, I already mentioned it, and I'm going to elaborate on this further, because this brings us to this huge next point. Because once we are here in the salutary deficit, now the next point comes. How are we going to deal with it? How are we going to make a change? How are we going to get out of this salutary deficit? And this is extremely important notion. So this is the element that I was already partially touched upon several minutes ago, talking about the river analogy, right? So learning to swim, or finding the ability to swim upstream, as opposed to hiding on the shore, because the shore doesn't exist. So what is this central point here? The central point here is the ability to get a eustress, right? Eustress. Let me get you the notion. So the eustress is the ability to convert the external impacts, right? The external impacts into the intrinsic positives. So once again, this is extremely important, because typically when you hear the word stress, right? Stress, you already think of this in the negative way, that this is something destructive. It might not be immediately destructive, but it's definitely destructive in the long run. So this is the huge point, a huge transformation delivered by the salutogenic reasoning, that actually it defines the distinction. Because in this classic standard framework, every stress is a de-stress, right? So it's always negative. Now, what we have? We have a different story. So basically, an external stress is not necessarily a negative thing anymore. If it's going wrongly, then it's distress, but then it could be a eustress. And if it's a eustress, that means that we've managed to convert the external impact within a certain range, of course, right? We managed to convert it into the positives. So this is absolutely huge, right? Because this actually explains us pretty much everything, right? It changes the total playing field, right? Because what we had before, like if you think of biomechanics, right? In biomechanics, there is no such a notion as the eustress. Biomechanics automatically assumes that any impact from outside is the de-stress. That's very important, critical. Think about it, because again, biomechanics, what is it? Most of it is the importation of the things that were developed and defined for the man-made objects, building vehicles and so on, into the biological field. Now, if you think of any man-made object, you never have a situation when external stresses, such as the friction or reaction forces, that they would be beneficial. They are not. they are destructive to the material. That's why the engineers bring lubricants. That's why they bring reinforcers. That's why they try to deal with those stresses. But those stresses are always negative. So this is the key mindset and the key fundamental science there. External stresses are negative. We can shield against them, we can dampen them, but we can never convert them into anything good. The friction in your car destroys it. It doesn't help it to get better. So now this is a completely different story. What happens, and that's what I've called by the abbreviation DISK, deep intrinsic stress converter. So if you have this deep intrinsic stress converter for the range of impacts, then you're going to have the U stress. Of course, if you don't have it, if your range of impacts goes beyond it, then you're going to have a D stress. So U stresses are going to make your child better. You're going to improve the salutary resources of your child. If you're going to accumulate D stresses, your child's condition is going to go down. So, but the opportunity, this is the unique, absolutely new theoretical room, like the room for the opportunity, the room for the improvement. Well, Dr. Antonovsky himself, he called this general resistive resources, but it's a little bit, because it originally comes from the social department and so on. So when we get to our field, I've sort of decided to use this term to highlight the whole point that there is a conversion, right? It's not just resistance, it's a conversion. It's being able to swim upstream, that's being able to convert the impact of the flow and use it to propel yourself in the other direction. So this is huge, absolutely massive discovery that takes place here. So that was the number 3. So now, when we want to define what we are doing, it's very simple. Actually, probably I have to get back to where I was, right? Stress and eustress. So basically that brings us back to what is the essence of ABR. The essence of ABR is the smart stress transfer. So now if you get back to my previous videos on the essence of the ABR technique, so this is where you're going to get. We are working in this specific range of stresses which is giving us the eustress response. So it's beautiful and clear, and again, finally we are having the space of our own. We are not confined in this antipathogenic thing. We can talk about building and working, salutary benefits, salutary extras, which by another researcher, they've received a very elegant name, which is the name of fortigenesis, right? So the accumulation of those U stresses here, that would be called the fortigenesis. Forti, right, as probably comes from the Latin fortis, which means strength, and the genesis is obvious, right? So fortigenesis. So basically what you are doing, you guys are doing the fortigenesis. You are delivering those mechanical stresses in the range which converts the external stress transfer into the intrinsic U stress, and that's the process, the strengthening process, which could be called the fortigenesis. Now, this brings us to the next point, which is, another huge part, right? Here we go. I'm reading for you here, health assets. Take a minute to understand this. This is huge. Absolutely huge. I already mentioned this in the previous part, right? So that the basic assumption, like the fundamental reference that precedes everything in interpretation that goes with the human body, it's being considered as a fine, as exceptionally intrinsic, exceptionally internally smart and so on, but a machine, a kind of vehicle, a computer, whatever, but a device. Now this, once we have this converter, right, this disk, the ability to convert the extrinsic impacts into the positive intrinsic growth, what is that? That gives us the opportunity to build health assets. But once we move in the health assets, what does it change? Well, we are no longer in the machines and devices, right? We are in the economy. And this is a huge transformation, because now you can think about it. See, you have to think of your child not anymore as, the vehicle, a broken vehicle that you need to fix and put on the move. You have to think about it differently. You have to think of it as a depleted economy, a distressed economy, as a shrunk economy. And, or, if you think of it, like your child incorporated, right? If you think from a business standpoint, your child currently has a profoundly, negative cash flow. His bank balance is extremely low. So his bank balance of the health assets is extremely low. So low to the point that he can't deal with their environmental stresses. This balance is too poor to convert those stresses into the extra eustress. And you see, this is really important thing to understand, because once you think about it, then you will understand some basic fundamentals. And the basic fundamentals being two things, right? So now, if you want some external functions, right? External functions, you need to have a certain bank balance of the health assets. If you don't have this bank balance of the health assets, well, that's not going to be anything good. Nothing good is going to happen. Now, another component is that if you think of the healthy child, how does it work? They have those functions, right? So that's this other component. The healthy kids, they have what we call the virtuous cycle, right? So their interaction with the environment in itself has this disk, right? So have this biomechanical conversion of the external stresses into the positive stresses. And actually, what happens, it works like a passive income. So this is really huge importance for you to understand. Healthy child, right, has sufficient economy size, sufficient assets to begin with, so he can earn sufficient interest, energetic to say so, which is enough to cover his needs for their functional activity.